Andy, there are speed figures and there are performance figures. Talk a little bit about the contrast.
Well, I guess you're referring to the sheets, I mean the Ragozin and Thorograph numbers. I should say, first of all, I have respect for both, which I would not necessarily say about a lot of other purveyors of figures. I mean, they are as serious about what they do, as we are. The area where I most differ with them is that as I've said, I want my number just to be a speed figure. I don't want to try to put other elements into it and to try to pretend that this is going to tell you everything you need to know about a horse's capabilities. And the big element that both of the sheets incorporate, apart from traditional speed figures, is ground loss. And if a horse goes wide, they upgrade him. I mean, if he's saving ground on the rail and traveling a shorter distance, he's downgraded because of that. And mathematically, this all makes sense. You're traveling a farther distance, shouldn't shouldn't your speed figure, reflect that fact? I think that the dynamics of racing are so complicated that there's a lot of interrelationships between different factors, and there are a lot of factors that then, including some that can't be easily quantified, that go into determining how well a horse is going to run in a race. And besides ground loss, you got two other key elements: pace and track bias. And to say, of all these different factors, we're going to count ground loss, but we're going to ignore the others in the numbers, then, my feeling is, what do you have? I'll give you one hypothetical example. Let's say you've got three horses battling head and head for the lead at a suicidal pace. They say they're going 44 flat, and they begin the weekend, and now a horse circles 4 wide and wins by a nose over the horse on the rail. If you're factoring in ground loss, that horse is going to get a much higher rating because he went wide. But in my view, the horse who was engaged in the suicidal duel for the lead really ran the better race. And to say we're going to make a judgment that we're going to count, we're going to weigh the ground loss, but we're going to pretend that the pace factor was not an issue, I think is not correct. So for me, I'd rather just have the number, and now I'll look at all with that as a frame of reference, I'll just look at all the other elements of the race, the ground loss, the pace, the track, any track bias if it exists, and try to form in my mind an overall assessment of that horse. But I'm not going to try to I'm not smart enough to make a number that would incorporate all those elements.
Andy, a casual racing fan, or even somebody who's been around racing for a long time, probably looks at you and thinks you're the mad scientist just looking at the numbers, and probably make all of your decisions based only on numbers. A, is that true? And B, if it's not true, what other factors are you looking for?
Well, in the old days, before other people had the figures, they were overwhelmingly my focus, because the figures alone were such an edge that I could make a profit without relying on much else. now that everybody's got them, I mean, I have to, I have to have more tools, and I spend whenever I'm playing seriously and following a race meeting or a circuit for a while, I put a huge amount of effort into watching horses' trips and making notes on all the races. I mean, I played Tampa this winter. I mean, I watched every race and reruns of those races, and I made notes on every horse that went into my database on DRF Formulator. So, whenever I am handicapping a race, my notes and my comments are embedded in the PPs, and what I try to do is to use the figures in conjunction with those trips to formulate an assessment of a horse. If I say you have a race where you have the three top figures are horses who run all in the mid-70s. But I know that one of these horses got loose on the lead on a gold rail at Tampa, and another horse was sitting in the pocket, behind a big speed duel and also having a perfect trip, while the third horse, had a 5-wide trip or otherwise had a difficult set of circumstances. That horse with the tougher trip would be, my perfect kind of bet. Because you're going to get much more value from a situation like that than if that horse had had an 80 and the other two horses had had a 70. Then you get no price.
Andy, when it's time to make a bet, tell us some of the tracks that you generally gravitate towards.
Well, over the years, the racing circuit I've played the most has been Florida during the winter. Early on in my career of making speed figures, I thought that Florida was potentially the most productive because you would have horses shipping in from all different parts of the country, and it was very difficult for somebody without speed figures, to know, whether that Kentucky horse was better than the horse coming from New York or from Canada. And so, over the years, I've devoted a lot of hours to handicapping Gulfstream, and of course in the old days Hialeah. In more recent years, I've played a lot of Tampa Bay because it has sort of that same element of horses, coming from different parts of the country, and I prefer as a figure guy, I prefer dirt racing to turf racing, and so I have no prejudice against real cheap horses. So Tampa has been my favorite my favorite track in recent years. And since my early days as a horse player, I've played Saratoga, and so every summer I'll start kind of focusing on Belmont and Midsummer, and then play through the end of the Saratoga meet.
Since you mentioned the difference between just a preference in dirt and turf, explain what the dirt, turf, and synthetic factors that are the different track surfaces nowadays with your figures. Do you feel more confident in dirt figures than the others?
Yes, dirt figures are, let's say it's easier to make accurate figures on the dirt. I mean, there are pitfalls in turf and synthetics, and they are almost all caused by pace. We know in synthetic track races, you look at Keeneland, you look at a lot of tracks, Golden Gate, where you just see like ridiculous slow paces, particularly in route races, sometimes even in sprints. And the same phenomenon happens on grass as well. And when the pace of a race gets so extremely slow, the horses can't accelerate enough at the end to run the final time of which they're really capable. This almost never happens on dirt. If you get horses going a half in 49, in a route race, they'll just run faster at the end, and a horse who's supposed to run a figure of 100 will run around 100. But when you get them going a half in 52 at Golden Gate, they're never gonna make that up, and so it creates a difficult element in making figures in these races. And in many cases we have to kind of superimpose kind of an arbitrary judgment on making the figures, because I see no point in putting down and publishing numbers that have nothing to do with the horse's ability. And if you have horses who could who are supposed to be running figures around 90, and because of the slow pace, the race comes up a 68, to put down and publish 68, is helps nobody. So we'll, we will do our best and arbitrarily assign a figure to the race that better reflects the horse's ability, or at least the kind of what they should be running on kind of the lower end of the the range that they might run. But it's as I say, it's the whole pace issue does, confuse the figure making process for those races some of the time.
I imagine that made it a challenge with a great horse like Zenyatta to get an accurate number on her, because she was so slow early. The math probably didn't help her in putting up big figures, just running on at the end like she did.
Right, of course, and and she was. Of course, she was running she was winning by necks and noses, and so some of the races did come up very slow, and there was the figures at least in some cases probably did not reflect her capabilities. But by the same token, many of the Zenyatta fans thought that, well, gee, she could, she was winning all these races, she can do anything. But the fact is, when she had a fast-paced race on the dirt and all the conditions were right, in the Breeders' Cup against Blame, she ran a figure of 111. So it wasn't like she was a 120 horse, being compromised by those slow paces.
In the published speed figure era, I think Ghostzapper's probably one of the fastest, if not the fastest, handicap championship level horse out there. Would you rate him among the fastest horses since the early 90s, since you went public?
Yes, I mean, his of horses going a distance, his figure of 128, was the tops. I mean, the early on, I mean, a little before the, our racing times, racing form era, Groovy ran a couple figures in the 130s as a sprinter, but Ghostzapper's races put him at the top. Easy Goer and Sunday Silence, ran great. One of the great unsung great horses of the last 20 years, I thought, was Formal Gold, who strung together, who who won as a first-time starter with a figure of 112 and strung together some 120-plus races, but Ghostzapper is at the top.
Well, you mentioned Easy Goer and Sunday Silence, and I think it's a great example of the need for a speed figure, or at least need to quantify, because in raw times, their Derby was one of the slowest ever run. With the wintry conditions, it snowed the morning of the Derby, the track was very slow. If you just looked at a raw time, you would not think that Easy Goer and Sunday Silence were two of the better Triple Crown slugfests that we've seen.
It was that Derby was weird on that sloppy track because they didn't run well. I mean, you had a few horses like bunched at the wire, so that any individual race, may not necessarily, when you're judging kind of great horses, they demonstrate their greatness in a variety of ways. So, one or two races, might just, come up, with moderate times, but inevitably or invariably, the great horses run fast sometime. And when you are making a list of the all-time greats, you'll look back and see that almost all of them are going to run in the 120 plus range. I think one of the great things about the figures is the ability to look and compare horses of different generations. I just wish we had numbers on our present day scale, back for Secretariat and Seattle Slew and Affirmed and the horses for the from that great decade. Unfortunately, my numbers were kind of still in their infancy at that time, so I really can't say with any certitude like how fast Seattle Slew ran on his best day.
Let's just go from the opinion scale, though. You've seen all the great champions. Let's do a couple matchups here. Secretariat, the greatest?
I would have to say so. Certainly, his Belmont Stakes would have to be the biggest figure of my lifetime. I went years later. I went back and tried to kind of reconstruct that day, and the best I could come up with was like a figure of 139, which would be the kind of the greatest of bigger than we have ever made. I also try to go back in to some of the great horses of generations before I was involved in racing. And I'll tell you, I think that the times of the published times of races in the 50s and earlier were so unreliable that I couldn't trust them. I mean, I looked at some of Count Fleet's races because the figure guy said he was in a class by himself. Well, I guess he was, because making my estimate of his figures was like in the mid 150s, if you'd believe those times, which I don't. But Secretariat's number one.